Welcome to Wine for Normal People, the podcast for people who like wine, but not the snobbery that goes with it. I'm your host, Elizabeth Schneider, author of the Wine for Normal People book and certified wine dork. Join me as I hit record on this conversation with a friend in the wine industry. This and all shows with guests are informal but educational discussions between passionate wine friends. All guests are personal friends or friends of friends in wine, not strangers. And like any conversation between friends, we're going to talk back and forth, interrupt each other, laugh, have fun, debate tough questions, voice opinions. Most of all, enjoy sharing our time together and with you. If you're in, pour yourself a glass, pull up a chair, and join us for this great chat. I hope you're ready for this awesome Encore presentation of Kevin Pogue talking about Terroir. You will learn more in this show than you will from almost any book. It is so digestible, so great. And I'm so glad you're listening to the show. You got to put what you've learned into action. There's no better way to get high quality wines than shopping at my exclusive sponsor's site, Wine Access. Go to wineaccess.com/normal. Join my wine club. Let me and Wine Access pick out 6 amazing bottles for you quarterly for just $150, which includes shipping. Coming up, Wines of France. Get in on it now. Wineaccess.com/normal. Listen in the middle of the show for more details. Dr. Kevin Pogue is one of the most famous people in Washington State wine. He's known around the world. He's a licensed geologist and professor of geology at Whitman College in Walla Walla. He has a doctorate in geology from Oregon State and decades of teaching and research experience. He's authored books, articles, done extensive research on the terroir of the Pacific Northwest, with a good portion of that spent investigating the deposits of the Missoula floods, which if you listen to any of the shows about Walla Walla, we talk about the Missoula floods. They're a pivotal event that formed the geological base of the region. Kevin's research today focuses exclusively on terroir, and his work's been featured in national and international journals. He owns a consulting company, Vinterra, through which he assists wineries in choosing the best sites, matching grape to site, educating winery owners, winemakers, their customers on why specific terroir leads to the style in their wine. He's one of the world's leading experts on terroir. I need to thank Eric McKibben from Amavi and Pepperbridge for the introduction. Kevin, I'm so thrilled you're here. I have a ton of questions for you, and I know you've made the rounds on podcasts and media, but I'm hoping we can still have a little bit of fun. So welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. It's great to be here. Happy to share what I know and hopefully steer wine in the right direction.
And certainly the listeners appreciate the help because I think there's a lot of misinformation that circulates, but we'll talk about that in a second. What I want to ask you is, how does somebody who grows up in Kentucky, does all this geology stuff in the Pacific Northwest, wind up going to the Himalayan thrust belt of northern Pakistan and then becoming an authority on terroir in Walla Walla? It's an interesting trajectory.
Yeah, it's kind of a crazy journey. I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky, in horse farm country there, and got my undergrad degree at University of Kentucky, but I always felt a little bit out of place there because my first love was outdoor recreation, especially sort of adventurous stuff in the mountains. I spent a lot of time in our local area, the Red River Gorge, which is an area outside of Lexington that has 60 or 70 sandstone arches and cliffs and caving and doing all kinds of crazy, risky stuff. But I really wanted to amp that up. So when I went to grad school, I went to Idaho State, where I could be close to the Tetons and the Sawtooths and the Wasatch, and ski and climb and do those things that I loved. I fell in love with teaching while I was a teaching assistant there, and then decided I needed a PhD if I wanted to teach at the college level. So then I looked for places to apply to, and I found that Oregon State had an ongoing research program in northern Pakistan in the Himalaya, and that was always a dream of mine to go to the Himalaya. So I applied and was accepted there, got involved in their Himalayan research project, and ended up doing sort of what I describe as Indiana Jones geology.
Oh, that's so cool.
In the tribal areas on the border with Afghanistan, in northern Pakistan. And it was, I could talk for about a day or two of crazy things and experiences I had over there. but the geology was
You're
unbelievable.
lucky you came back alive, my friend.
Yeah, but not for the reasons most people would think. I mean, actually, the people that I met in the countryside were incredibly hospitable and friendly, and I never felt threatened by the people. I was welcomed and treated with great respect. I'm lucky I survived driving in that country because there's a lot of crazy drivers, a lot of crazy roads, but I miss it. And I had a great time over there. And I was continuing that research after I got my teaching position at Whitman College and working with students right up until 9/11 happened. And that basically shut me down because then it became pretty impossible to go over there and work in the areas I wanted to work, because I was actually moving closer to Afghanistan over time, and that turned out to be a problem.
Yes.
And but at the same time I was doing that here in Walla Walla, I was getting involved in the wine scene. I had a lot of friends that were in the wine industry, and they were dragging me out to look at soil pits and talking to me. Hey, you know about this stuff. What is this stuff? What do you think about this? And at some point, I think more than one person thrust a copy of James Wilson's Terroir book into my hands. And I enjoyed wine. I've been since college and had always loved the stories and everything associated with wine, and the fact that it comes from a specific place and that it tastes different because of the place and all that I kind of understood. But after the Terroir book, reading that, I realized just how seriously the French in particular take that concept. And then I started thinking, wow, we're not really paying too much attention to that. Instead of, a lot of folks in a new wine growing region in the New World are often, they plant the grape they happen to like on the ground they happen to own.
Yeah, and a little bit of climate. That's like, is it warm enough? That seems like how people do it, right? And in California, it's warm enough to do everything.
And that's just like completely counter to the idea of matching variety to site and finding if you own 100 acres, where are the best 10 acres in that 100, and it's not like growing corn where you're trying to increase yields. It's like, I tell people, what corn farmer in Iowa goes down the rows and rips off the ears and throws them to the ground just so that the remaining ears of corn will be that much better, right?
It is really weird. Let me just go back and ask you a question, though.
Sure.
Okay, so one of the things that I experienced when I got to California, I worked for a very large winery in California. And growing up on the East Coast, we're a little bit more oriented towards Europe and the European wines and things like that. A lot of people know a lot about that here. And when I got to California, I remember the wine educator at the big hulking winery being like, well, terroir is a bunch of junk. It's junk science. I don't believe it. There's all this proof from UC Davis. This was in 2005. I don't know what he would think now. That is not the last time I heard that from other people who've done winemaking enology programs. What would you say to that? It just seems like you didn't have that gut feel. So it's a different orientation, no?
Here's what I'd say to that. This is the easiest thing to dispel in the world, okay? So what do we call variations in wine quality related to differences in climate from year to year? So in Bordeaux, some wines from some years cost a fortune.
Right.
Some years they don't cost a fortune, right?
Right.
We call that vintage variation, right?
Yep.
And basically what we're saying is the wines taste very differently from year to year because the climate was different between those years. So that's temporal terroir. That's not spatial terroir. That's temporal terroir. If you believe that wines can taste differently because the climate is different from one year to the next, then you have to believe that wines can taste differently because the climate is always different in this place than it is in that place.
Right.
So it's not even a question, right? It's science to prove that instantaneously. So there's the problem with terroir is a lot of people have misused it in a lot of different ways, mostly in marketing and promotion of wines and in ways that are just completely silly. But the term, as it's used now, some people dismiss it. And, there's this book written by the retired UC Davis professor called Terroir and Other Wine Myths. and he sets up straw men and shoots them down. He says, well, terroir literally means wines that taste like dirt. Well, it used to mean that in the 1600s, maybe, or the 1500s, but the meanings of terms change over time in the way we use them. The English language is full of words like that, and it doesn't mean that now. And there is a definition of terroir. People will say there's no definition.
Yes, give us the definition. Tell us what, because I'm going to ask you a bunch of detailed questions about it. We need to get clear on what the definition is. What is it? So
a major worldwide wine organization argued for 5 years, and based in France, over what does this mean? And I used to go to the internet.
OIV?
Yeah. And I used to go to the terroir meetings all the time before COVID. And we'd talk about what the OIV decided for their terroir definition. And I'd meet all these people from all over the world and everything. This is the definition. So you can look it up online, OIV terroir definition. That's it. And I think
I posted it before.
Good.
And they added the hand of man recently.
No, I mean, in the original one, there's a cultural component.
Yeah.
But the thing that people don't get and leave out in terroir is, and because it's complicated, is that basically what terroir says is that there are site-specific things that affect the sensory components of consumable products, not just wine, but wine most often we think about, and that those differences in the sensory components can be traced back to something specific in the area in which that product was produced. So it's both of those things. You can't say, for instance, something like, oh, the terroir of this wine is limestone. That's the bedrock of that wine region. That's not the terroir. And you can't say the terroir of this is flinty, earthy cow poop or something, right? Because that's the sensory component. You have to have both things. You have to say, this wine tastes this way because of this. It's a direct terroir connection. And so unless you can define both of those things and say where it's coming from, then it's not terroir. And not every wine is a wine of terroir, has something in it that you can trace back to. Alice Firing came out and gave a talk in my class one time, and she said, everybody can talk, but not everybody has something to say, right? So, yes. And I think that's true about wines. And then the cultural component of terroir is a slippery slope, because in Europe, and especially, the way in which grapes are grown and wines produced is codified in the AOC or the DOC. There's all these rules and regulations, and that's adapted from the way that those wines have always been made and produced over hundreds and hundreds of years. And they adopted this. And if you want to call it a Chateauneuf du Pape, for instance, you have to do all of these things. That makes the wines start to taste like one another, right? Because there's a united cultural component to making the wine that affects it. So,
but not all Chateauneuf is created equal by any means.
Obviously.
Yeah,
no.
So that's
no, but I would argue that there is a cultural component to Chateauneuf du Pape wines, because you can only use certain grapes, you can only get to a certain ripeness. There's all these rules and regulations. And in Walla Walla or Napa Valley or anywhere in the New World, we don't have any of that. You might say, okay, 90% of the cabs in Napa Valley are going through a de-alking process now because the grapes are getting too ripe. If that's true, that's becoming a cultural terroir component, right? If everybody is doing it. Is
Velcorin part of that too? The poison they put in to smooth out the mouthfeel?
So anyway, if everybody in a region is doing it and all the wines are starting to develop a distinctive component of sensory component from that practice, then it becomes a cultural terroir. But people are using it and saying like, well, I'm a winery and I make my wines this way. That's my cultural terroir. Well, no, because you could do anything then, right? It has to be sort of an adopted set of standards over the region that you're talking about. And then people try to apply terroir too broadly on the physical scale to say something like, oh, I can taste that this is a Napa Valley terroir. Well, it could be from Calistoga, or it could be from Carneros, or it could be from up on the mountains. And those are completely different physical terroirs. So I tell people you should not, and I've written 7 AVA petitions now, so I know what's involved in that.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that.
You should not equate terroir with an AVA, because AVAs are in general, much too large to say that an AVA expresses a terroir. I tell people AVAs are collections of terroirs assembled by the growers to market the wines from a specific region.
Okay, so what's the difference between an AVA and a DOC, for instance, for you? Or do you find it to be the same?
No, there's huge differences.
Wait, but there's another question here too, which is, I think that the AVAs, at least I only know a few of them that you've worked on, but they tend to be more specific than some of the California AVAs. So are you following the DOC model a little bit more than what's going on elsewhere?
I'd like to think so. I try to make my petitions what I describe as unassailable based on their merits. The boundaries are not BS. Nobody can look at one of my petitions and say, that line that you drew, there's nothing different on one side of it or the other, so why does that line exist, right? I can show you dozens and dozens of AVAs where I kind of think that's the case. And I think that the Rocks District of Milton Freewater, which was the first petition I wrote, is the most terroir-driven AVA in the United States. 100%. 100%. It's one soil type, one landform, a restricted range of elevations. It's only 3,700 acres or something like that. So it's small, but I think it comes the closest of any AVA to being a single terroir AVA. But even there's variations, right? But when you look at something like the Columbia Valley, which is massive and has a range of elevations from sea level to 3,000 feet, and things like that. And it's ludicrous to talk about the terroir of the Columbia Basin as something that all the wines from the Columbia Basin have some shared sensory component.
It's absurd that we would even call it that. I mean, that would be an IGP. It would be an enormous area if it were in Europe.
I think it's the size of Belgium, actually.
It's enormous. I wouldn't be surprised. All right. So we have our definition. I want to ask some questions about slope. These are some things that I've read people ask me about, and I'm going to ask you these questions that I sometimes feel like I'm getting bad information on. Grapes that grow on slopes, especially in a place like Italy where valley floor fruit is not very good, they are often higher quality. Alsace talks about that too. A lot of places say valley floor fruit is not great. They tend to lose acidity. They get plumper and riper. They're just not as flavorful as the stuff on hillsides. Why is that? Does this have to do with air drainage? Does it have to do with solar radiation? What is it?
That's a great observation. That's true. I mean, if you look at grape vineyards all over the world, they tend to be on slopes. And the single most important thing in terms of soil and what the grapes are growing in or where the grapes are growing is water, is how available water is to the plant and how the availability of water does or does not impart stress to the grape. So there's that. And then a very underappreciated aspect of viticulture, I think, is soil temperature and how warm the soils get, because grapes really like warm feet and they really respond in the phenological stages to being triggered by warmer soil. So if you plant on slopes, in south-facing slopes in the Northern Hemisphere, right, first off, a slope will tend to have shallower soils over the bedrock simply because there are downslope movement processes driven by gravity called mass wasting that keep moving material down the hill and don't allow it to build up in one place. So you tend to have shallower soils. And if you're in an area, especially where you can't irrigate and you get rain throughout the year, as you would in Italy or France or Germany, the soils on the slopes are not going to have as much water holding capacity. And because they're south facing, they're going to dry out faster. And those things are going to impart water stress to the grapes. You're going to end up having grapes that are stressed, a little more stressed out. They're going to produce fruit that has more open clusters, smaller berries, thicker skins, and those things are all equated with better wines, right?
Right.
And if you're down the valley, you're going to have thick alluvial soils because that's where the soil that's moving down the hill is ending up in the valley.
And the
also,
rain.
And the rain, then you'll have more water holding capacity in those soils. You might even have a higher water table if you're in an alluvial basin where the grapes can potentially get their roots into the water table and be sub-irrigated, which makes huge canopies, big fat grapes. There have been some amazing studies done in Germany where basically you could correlate the price of Riesling to the slope and the aspect of the hillsides there. Yeah, no, it's a thing. And there's physical reasons why it's true. Yes.
Okay, I have a really specific question. People talk about air draining off the slope and replace the cold air draining down off the slope and then warm air rising. And so it protects the grapes on the slope. But then for every 100 meters that you go up, the temperature drops about a degree in Celsius. So is it cooler or warmer on the slopes?
Okay.
And when they're talking about air replacement, is that only during frost? Is that when it counts when the frost settles on the valley floor and then on the slope, you don't have frost risk? Or is this all the time? And I don't really get it, why it's warmer and colder on the slope. I don't get it.
Okay. Well, I've actually done a ton of research on that topic. So, so it's kind of hard to summarize it quickly, but the number that you threw out there about decrease in temperature with height is called the environmental lapse rate. And that's kind of a general figure for all over the place. And the reason that temperatures decrease with height in the troposphere, or the lower part of the atmosphere, is because the atmosphere is primarily heated by the ground. And so there's less ground up there and there's more ground down below. And the atmosphere is not heated by the sun shining through it, which a lot of people think. It's heated because the sun hits the ground heats up, the ground heats the atmosphere, that warm air rises. As it rises, it decompresses and it cools. So generally it gets cooler. That's the typical situation. Okay. So yes, the temperature does in general get cooler as you go up. However, a lot of times at night, after the sun goes down, then the cool air that's up in the mountains, because it's more dense, sinks and moves down the sides of the mountain and collects on the valley floor and can create something which we have a lot in Walla Walla, the Yakima Valley, in the Willamette Valley, lots of places, a situation called a temperature inversion, which means the temperature actually gets warmer as you go up. So in the Walla Walla AVA, for instance, it goes down to an elevation of 400 feet above sea level. You would be crazy to plant vinifera grapes below about 700 feet in the Walla Walla AVA because you would freeze out every year because the coldest place is the lowest place. And I did a study in the Willamette Valley that showed also that in the Willamette Valley, especially in the spring and in the fall, when there's not a lot of wind and there's clear skies, you get cold air settling in the valleys, and you have the coldest mornings in those growing areas at the lowest elevations. Sometimes we even flirt with freezing in late August at the very lowest place in the Walla Walla Valley.
That's nuts.
Having said that,
because it's really hot during the day.
Yeah, right. So that you see diurnal variations in those places of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In fact, we had a diurnal variation at that place, because I follow this kind of stuff. There was almost 60 degrees. We went from 40 to 100 on one day in early September. So the reason that, you want good cold air drainage, you don't want pockets. There was a large planting recently on Red Mountain in Washington State, and the people came up from California to advise them on what to do. And they did what they would do in California. They just blanket planted everything. And I saw that they had planted down in the valleys, and everything froze out like 3 years in a row down in the valleys. Of course it did. So because in California, it's not going to do that because they don't have as big a temperature inversion situation as we do. So it's good to plant on slopes to let that cold air move down the slope and go down into the bottom of the valley and keep off of your. We have one area here in the Walla Walla Valley that I'm very excited about, in the North Fork Valley of the Walla Walla River, where in 2016, and it's a higher elevation site, about 2,000 feet. In 2016, we had our last frost on February 6th and our first frost on December 5th.
Oh,
There was a
wow.
10-month frost-free season there. And the areas at lower elevation,
that's very unusual, right? I mean,
really unusual.
Yeah,
but it always has a longer growing season there than the lower elevation sites because, and that year the growing season at 2,000 feet was 3 months longer than the growing season at 1,000 feet. And so sites that were 5 miles apart had 3-month difference in growing season. That's why this learning about how topography affects your climate is incredibly important to knowing where to plant your grapes, right?
Okay, absolutely. And it's also that you can't take your knowledge from one place and just plunk it down in another.
Absolutely.
And here's the question. So not every place, though, has a temperature inversion.
Almost any place can develop a temperature inversion. You're not likely to notice it on top of a mountain or something like that. But any flat area that on a cold, clear night with no wind to stir up the atmosphere, there's a natural tendency of the atmosphere in the early morning hours to stratify based on the density of the air. So the cool air will sink down to the ground. That's why you get a frost on the grass or you get dew in the morning because there's cold air right down near the ground. It might not be cold enough to cause a freeze event or damage your grapes or anything, but temperature inversions are pretty common. Seattle had one yesterday that trapped all this horrendous smoke all over the Puget Sound, and people were gagging on smoke yesterday because the air couldn't mix out because the cool marine air, dense, heavy marine air was trapped beneath warmer air above, and it filled with smoke down there and wouldn't mix out. They had horrible conditions. So you can get temperature inversions in a lot of places. The enemy of temperature inversions is wind.
Right, because it'll blow it out.
So because it mixes. Anyway, but slopes are good because they do allow cold air to move downhill and away from your vines. So,
right, but it does sound like it's also because of the soil, and it's also because there's a lot of different reasons for it. I hope you're enjoying this Encore presentation. Let's thank my sponsor again, who has so many amazing wines of Terroir and has some great Washington wines that they feature. Wine Access. One of my biggest issues with Washington wines, I love them, but I can't get them. So this is where Wine Access comes in. They have access to high quality wines that you can't get elsewhere, and they've delivered right to your door. I love brands like DeLille and Kay, and they have those and more. It's not just Washington. Wine Access has wines from big iconic wines to wines you've never heard of, but they are all high quality, sourced by their outstanding team of wine professionals. And I'll remind you again, if you want a selection of special wines that I meticulously select, join the Wine Access Wine for Normal People Wine Club by going to wineaccess.com/normal. You'll pay $150 4 times a year for wines that I select. They revolve around a theme. I write you a letter about why I picked the wines, do tasting videos available on Wine Access's YouTube channel. If you join the club, you get a discount on anything else you buy on the site. Check it out today. Start exploring wines you can't get locally, delivered right to your door. Wineaccess.com/normal. And if you just want to get into the site and let them know you found out about them through me, wineaccess.com/WFNP. Also, cannot do the show without the support of you, the patrons. patreon.com/wine for normal people is how you will join this amazing community. I was just in New York. I met up with a patron. We had a bottle of wine. We are having live meetups all over the place. Put down your phone, go meet up with people and have a glass of wine. This is what Patreon brings for you. Also, just a community of great fun conversation. You also get discounts off classes. You get mini classes if you're at the Wine Lover level. Plus, you get opportunities to go on trips with me. You can't do that unless you're a patron. So go to patreon.com/wine for normal people. Do it today. Even if you don't want to participate in any of that, it supports the show and keeps it going. Another great thing, Wine for Normal People classes. Go to winefornormalpeople.com/classes. I have launched a whole bunch of new classes. Wines of Rhone is this week. I've got Wines of California coming up and Greats of Italy. There are so many wonderful classes coming up. They are just $30 a person. You buy the wines locally. You can buy as many or as few as you like. Have a friend over. It's a live class. I will be there. I hope you will too. winefornormalpeople.com/classes. And now let's get back to this awesome Encore presentation of Kevin Pogue on Terroir. The other question is orientation. In this Northern Hemisphere, we talk about south-facing slopes being very important, although now we're starting to talk about north-facing slopes actually having place. But south-facing slopes, does it really make a difference whether you have southeast versus southwest-facing slopes?
Yes.
Is the morning sun actually cooler than the afternoon sun, or is that also not exactly true? That's
not exactly true.
Okay.
The intensity of solar radiation is a function of how high above the horizon the sun is. And so obviously an hour after sunrise and an hour before sunset, it's at the same azimuth above the horizon. But the difference is that when the sun is shining on your grapes in the morning, it's colder, right? And the ground is colder, the air is colder. The sun is working to heat that up and get it warming up, right? Whereas in the afternoon, the ground and the air have already heated up because the sun's already been up for 10 or 12 hours, and it's adding to that. So basically, if you have thin-skinned grapes or that are heat susceptible, you might want to be more towards the southeast side, especially if you tend to be colder in the morning and you want it to warm up faster. And if you're worried about heat stress, also because the place that's going to cook your grapes the most is the southwest face, right? Because you'll be adding the afternoon sun to the already heated up ground and air surrounding the vineyard. So if you're in a marginal area for getting your grapes ripe, you might be tending towards the southwest slope, southwest probably.
Burgundy's all southeast facing, at least in the Côte
d'Or. A lot of
that
east.
Doesn't seem to bother anybody's grapes.
Burgundy there's a lot of east, even east.
Right.
East and southeast is the most common. And that's good for, a tender, thin-skinned grape like Pinot Noir that you don't want to cook in the afternoon sun. The good stuff's all on the slopes, right?
Well, that's why I'm trying to pull it in together. I just did a two-part series on the Côte de Beaune, so this really makes it come together. So it sounds to me like a lot of what you're saying is about soil temperature, so that makes sense. But what about direct sunlight and solar radiation? So for instance, when you talk to people who grow grapes in like Salta in Argentina, the vines are at 10,000 feet. They say that the solar radiation changes the chemistry inside the grapes, and that because the stuff is on these high plateaus, that it's different. And then there are other people that say like the angle and the way that the sun hits the slope, this again goes back to why the grapes are better on slopes, is stronger or more direct versus a valley floor where it would be more diffused. Is that true, or is that bull?
No, absolutely. You get the maximum absorption of solar radiation when the slope is normally incident to the rays. It makes a right angle with the rays. So it was something like in Walla Walla on the solstice, if you wanted to have maximum solar radiation, you'd have to plant on a 22-degree slope facing south. But in Napa Valley, because it's farther south, you'd only have to plant on a 14-degree slope to get maximum solar radiation. Basically, you change the angle just like solar panels. They make these solar panels that sit on tilting planes, right? That keep track of the sun, and they change their tilt as the sun moves around the arc. You get maximum solar radiation at a certain angle. Of course, you're not going to be able to change the angle of your slope, so you got to decide what slope is
to plant on,
best for you. And of course, farming practices come in because it becomes a pain in the butt to farm things, especially once they get past about 15 or 20 degree slopes, because your tractors start tipping over.
Yeah, look at Mosul, right?
Yeah, you got to wait, or unless you want to build monorails like they have in Mosul or the Vaud in Switzerland. So when they talk about Argentina, right, you're talking about something different. You're talking about altitude, right? And the difference there is that, the solar radiation is more intense at higher elevations because there's less atmosphere for the sun's rays to pass through and absorb some of that energy. So water vapor is a big component of the atmosphere is water vapor, which can absorb solar energy. There's haze and dust and all kinds of particulate matter in the air that when you get higher in the atmosphere, that stuff goes away. And so the sky gets bluer because if you go way up high in the mountains. So if you're at a very high elevation, the wavelength spectrum that you're receiving is different than when it is down low because you're getting a lot more ultraviolet radiation. You're probably getting maybe a little less of other wavelengths. And so they're right when they say it's a different spectrum, it's a different kind of radiation. I'm not going to tell you that I can taste the difference in the wines because of that, because I want to see science. I want to see somebody grow the same grape in the same kind of soils at different altitudes and see what it is. But
they definitely have different flavors than the stuff in Mendoza. But at the same time, they're also at 26 degrees south latitude.
Right, exactly. And the
34.
reason they can get away with those high altitudes is simply because they're closer to the equator.
The dirt issue, which you alluded to before, so many times you hear people in wine only talk about soil and you've already brought this up. Is soil important? Is it the minerals? Is it the lack of fertility, as you said? Is it microbiomes? There's all this stuff on microbiomes now. That's the big thing.
Yes.
And I think you believe this. If you have a glass of wine from Chablis, it doesn't taste like any other Chardonnay in the world. There's got to be some reason for that. So they in Chablis will always talk about soil before they talk about all of the other things that I think are probably equally important, but they love their limestone. Right. So you can't taste the limestone, but what do you say to these?
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, sommeliers. Well, I mean, you can't, what would you do? You could lick a rock and maybe you can get some essence. I'm sure you've done that before, but
no, you won't taste anything if you lick limestone.
But when you go to wine events, all you hear are people talk about dirt. That's all they want to talk about. And I always try to say that terroir is so much more than dirt. Help explain this.
Yes, everything you said is right. Terroir is so much more than dirt. First off, you hear people say, my dirt is limestone, my dirt is sandstone, my dirt is granite. And that's not dirt, that's bedrock, right? Soil is something that evolves over time from the decomposition and disintegration of bedrock mixed with organic materials. And it may or may not have anything to do with the bedrock underneath. So, for instance, here in the Columbia Basin, we have wind-deposited soils that have nothing to do with the underlying basalt bedrock, right? They're completely different chemically. So you can't always just say, oh, my wine's this way because my bedrock is like this, because it may not be, because it may not have anything to do with your bedrock. But anyway, the most important thing about soils, which I've alluded to earlier, is the way in which the texture and mineralogical composition of those soils transmit water to the vine. That's what the vine cares about the most, is the hydrologic properties of how coarse they are, what the clay content is, and whether or not the grape can get water when it wants to, and at what level it can get water to, and how, anyway, the water is transmitted. That's maybe the single most important part. Probably the second most important thing in my mind is the thermal properties of the soil. How does that soil retain heat, or does it retain heat? And that works hand in hand with how much water is in the soil, because water affects heat retention. So the thermal properties of the soil, the textural properties of the soil. Probably the next most important thing is the microbiome, which is a function. This is the thing people, and I've had people get in my face and say, well, Kevin, you're a geologist. It really doesn't really have anything to do with the rocks. It's really all about the biology. What's the biology of that soil? And my response to that is, polar bears don't live in the Sahara, right? And camels don't live in the Antarctic. The microbiome that lives where it does that because of the physical characteristics of that soil, right? What's that? The same microbiome wouldn't live in a soil that had a different chemistry and a different pH. So I don't have a problem with saying that a lot of the sensory components in wines that are related to soils come from the critters that go into the wine. That's fine, but you get different suites of critters depending on what the climate, soil, and hydrology of the soils are, right? And they wouldn't be the same. Because you're right, you can't taste the limestone, you can't taste basalt, you can't taste these things, but you might be able to taste the result of the unique microbiome that only grows in this limestone-based soil or only grows in this basalt-based soil.
You know what the problem is? People think you can taste soil. But I think what you're saying is if we could understand that it wasn't the soil you were tasting, you could use that as a shorthand to say it tastes. Right. Some things do taste chalky, though, or they taste mineral-like. But that's the taste or the perception. It's not the actual, like someone's rubbing. I know people know that you're not rubbing chalk, but again, you hear these. This is why I never go to wine events, because you just hear sommeliers waxing poetic about, don't you taste the blah? And it's like, no, not, first of all, not everybody does taste that. And second of all, there's a lot of different components that come together and they tell you you're wrong if you don't taste it. So it's a very odd scenario, isn't it?
And then there's the M word, minerality, right? Which there's zillions of articles written about. I have a whole lecture in my terroir class just discussing that term. And what I've discovered is that sommeliers and critics invoke that word oftentimes for anything that they can't think of anything organic. They can't say peach, they can't say raspberry or currant or anything. And if it's an inorganic flavor, I've seen it used for all kinds of different flavors, minerality. But the commonality is it seems to be a go-to term to describe a flavor that you can't compare to a vegetable or a fruit or anything organic.
It's a little unoriginal, isn't it? It's sort of like calling a wine masculine or feminine. I don't know how where you come down on that, but I sort of think that I'm not so much offended by the fact that some wines are called feminine. It just seems like a failure of imagination that you couldn't think of something better to say than that. So you say that. And minerality, I mean, is it like a waterfall? Does it smell like the chalk erasers that we used to clean? There's a lot of different elements. And when you are describing it to actual people who are listening to the show, normal people, right? That's what these are, people who love wine lovers. They could understand something a little bit more accessible, but minerality is then a shutout term. It's like, don't you taste the minerality? Well, I don't know what that is. So get more specific about it. Isn't this wine feminine? What the hell does that mean? Are you saying, I mean, I'm feminine, but I don't smell like flowers, and it seems like a failure of language.
We can do better, but it's firmly entrenched. And I can even taste a wine and say, yep, this is a minerally wine. But I know that typically what that means for me is that it's got a lot more acidity. It's probably not as ripe. It doesn't have a lot of opulent fruit flavors. It has a sharpness in it. It's because it's higher in acid. And so most of the wines I hear people describe as minerality are higher acidity wines that aren't as ripe. But that doesn't sound as sexy as saying as wonderful minerality.
Yes, but I think there's some wines that smell like a waterfall. I mean, there's some outdoor scents that we could get better at. I need to ask you about the hand of man again. So I want to talk about the rocks because I agree with you. I think it is the most unique terroir in the United States. I love Syrah anyway, but when I had that for the first time, I could not believe how different it was from anything I've ever had from the U.S. So you are the father of the appellation here. And others scouted it out, but you were the one who really did the studies on it to get the AVA passed. And you have to go pretty deep in order to do that. I mean, the guys from Cayuse and all the other people I understand that they found the site, but you did the work on it. No?
Yeah. Okay. I'll expound on the rocks for a little bit. I agree with you. I think, and I heard Jeb Dunnick say that he thought it was one of the best examples of terroir of any place in the world. And I agree with you. Syrah is like my favorite grape because I think it's the most terroir expressive grape. Sorry, Pinot Noir.
Oh,
Anyway,
Riesling. You don't insult Riesling. Come on.
yeah, well, Riesling's great too, but Syrah to me is the most terroir express. I think that's part of the reason that some people don't buy Syrah, because the American consumer, when they go to the grocery store and they buy Bud Light, they want it to be Bud Light, right? And if they buy one Syrah and then they go back and they grab a bottle that says Syrah, but it's from another producer, another place, it tastes completely different.
Yes.
And that's so cool. But to a lot of people, that's so bad because it's not what I wanted. Anyway, back to the rocks. First off, the Rocks District area was the first area planted with grapes in the Walla Walla Valley in the late 1800s by Italian immigrants. And there was thousands of gallons of grapes being grown there in the late 1800s. I have old magazine articles raving about the terroir of the rocky ground in Milton Freewater from 1906.
Were they growing Italian grapes, do you think?
They were growing Senso.
Oh, ooh.
And calling it Black Prince. And
okay.
Then there was a winery there in the 50s called Blue Mountain Winery. And there's still some of the vineyards left, some wild growing Senso still growing there. It was recognized very early on by European immigrants as a great place to grow not only grapes, but fruit trees. So it was kind of rediscovered in the 1990s by other people. And now it's quite celebrated. You know, the crazy thing is that you can plant, even Cabernet sometimes tastes like it comes from the rocks, more like it tastes than Cabernet. I don't fully understand why that is. It's a unique soil made of basalt cobblestones. It's not like Châteauneuf-du-Pape where there's a layer of cobblestones on the top and then clay underneath. It's cobblestones for like 50 or 100 feet deep. So the grapes never get out of these basalt cobblestones.
Wow.
And it's just gravels. It's kind of a colder spot in the Walla Walla Valley. Has really high diurnal variations. The wines have a very high pH. They tend to be very soft. A lot of producers add acid to them because the grapes are so soft. But I think there is an indigenous yeast there that I think is critical to the flavor there, that is a really vigorous yeast that chews through fermentations really fast. And I think that the rocks terroir really shines through more in the vineyards that are clean cultivated. Some people have established grass between the rows because it's difficult for people working in the vineyards to be walking on
rocks,
rocks all the time. And they're black rocks and they get hot and it wants to twist your ankles because they're big rocks and it's hard on equipment. And so I'm just going to try to suppress the rocks and get a grass growing. And the grapes that come from those vineyards, I don't think express the terroir as well. So part of it, I think, is related to the rocks being on the surface, absorbing heat and radiating it to the clusters. I did some research on that. If you have the grapes trellised pretty low to the ground, the grapes are getting 2 or 3 degrees centigrade warmer in the ripening season than if they were trellised over grass, because the rocks I've taken a thermal imaging gun and shot the rocks, and some of the rocks are getting to 140 degrees Fahrenheit.
Oh my gosh.
Because they're black rocks sitting out in the sun, and it's sunny here in the summer, and we get temperatures over 100, and you literally cannot hold one of these rocks in your hand in the middle of the day in late July on a day where it's 90s to 100. If you pick up one of the rocks, you hold it for a few seconds and you have to drop it. And so that rock is radiating heat in the infrared to the grapes that are. So a lot of the classic growers that are really trying to capture the essence of the rock have their grapes trellised so that they're only 1.5 feet above the rocks where they can get this heat. And then there are other growers that say, well, I don't want my workers to have to bend over that far. I'm going to put them up here at 3 or 4 feet above the ground, and I'm going to put grass between the rows. So there's a cultural component. I think there'd be even a more uniform terroir expression if everybody clean cultivated, hung their grapes low.
Because I was going to ask you, there's some versions of it that have the funk. So some of that is probably from the native yeast that you're talking about.
Probably.
And then there's others that just taste like good Syrah, but they're kind of boring, and which you never want, because the whole point of the rocks is to have the funk, like have that delicious different component that comes from the microbiomes, that comes from
Right.
whatever else is there. But it's sad when you get one and you're like, oh gosh, this is just, it's good, but it's not what I wanted. I wanted the rock.
So you say, yeah, but I've run blind tastings and with wine education groups, and there's always 2 or 3 people that taste the rocks wine and go, oh, wine's not supposed to taste like this, because it's so outside their, I think it's fantastic. And I love the fact that it's so unique and different. I think they're delicious. But for some people, wine is supposed to taste a certain way. And if it doesn't taste that way, it's not right, or it's not wine. And I, of course, as a terroir guy, I celebrate diversity and stuff. And I
think there's a difference between a beverage and a wine. That's kind of how I look at it. There are very expensive beverages that are made in wine, hundreds of dollars of beverage. Many of them are made in places that are very famous, but they are beverages because they are things that don't reflect anything about the whole thing is that wine is supposed to come from fruit, and it's supposed to come from a place. And if it doesn't, then I'm not sure what it is then. There's a certain point in my mind where processing takes over. We have to do stuff to a grape to make it into wine. So I'm not a big natural wine person, because you got to do something to it. And we spent 8,000 years trying to clean this stuff up so it tastes as good as it tastes today. So we should probably go with that. But at the same time, you don't want to obliterate whatever you spent so long growing. I mean, it's just absurd. All right, I have one more question for you, because I had lots of Washington questions, and maybe if you will be generous with your time, we'll have you on another time to talk about Washington specifically. What do you think could happen with the AVA system in the future? Could we make changes to it, or has the horse really left the barn in terms of how we do things in the United States? Could we possibly fathom a system more like Europe, which to me is actually a consumer system? I know it is to protect culture, but ultimately there is no better consumer indicator if somebody can take the time to learn about the labels and where things are from. There's nothing better than those systems, because they don't guarantee quality, but they definitely guarantee production method. It's going to vary based on producer, yet the areas are small enough and uniform enough in most cases that we do get something like the rocks, where pretty much, like we said, there's going to be some producers that aren't going to take advantage of the terroir, but there's always that wherever you go. What's going to happen, from a terroir perspective, as more people care about it? Could it ever change, or are we just going to keep doing this? There's a lot of AVAs that make no sense.
Yeah, I agree that there are AVAs that are far too generalized and don't really make much sense. But if we, again, in its present configuration, you have to separate AVAs from terroir because they're not the same thing. They're a marketing thing, right? And that have some loose physical characteristic that kind of unites them all, that may or may not show any expression in the finished product. So I don't see us changing the whole procedure of making AVAs, but what I do see perhaps are people creating smaller and better AVAs that really do have more of a terroir component built into them. But there is a huge backlash of people that, for whatever reason, hate AVAs, think there's too many of them. We shouldn't have all these AVAs. They're meaningless. They confuse the customer. I keep hearing this because I write petitions, and the thing is, nobody holds a gun to your head and makes you put the AVA on your bottle.
That's right.
You don't have to do it.
You could put American wine on your bottle.
Wine, so there's no reason for the consumer to be confused, because if you think it's detrimental to you selling your wine, why do you want it, and why would you put it on your bottle? We have a lot of AVAs in Washington State that you almost never see on a bottle. I can name 2 or 3 that you may never even heard of. And that's fine. They exist. And at least you can go to a website somewhere if you want to be educated about what the growing conditions are, right? And you can read about the AVA if you're smart, you'll take advantage of a petition written by somebody like me, which becomes a public document. And you'll mine that for all this great information that helps you explain to the public what your growing conditions are like and helps you highlight what you're doing. So in France, for instance, if you propose a new AVA and you say, well, it's got all these characteristics and it has this history and everything, the French government sends a team of scientists and historians to verify that what you said is accurate, right? And nobody does that here.
Right. Well, it's also regulated by the agricultural body there, as opposed to us, where it's regulated by the Tax and Trade Bureau, which makes no sense.
And here, the TTB relies on the comment period to weed out any untruths that might be there. So they say, okay, this met all the criteria for this to be a perfected petition. We'll rework it, put it out there. And then it's got 2 months for people to comment and say, well, this is absolute hogwash. And if that's the case, they would send it back to the petitioner and say, address this. Is this really hogwash?
When does that ever happen?
I think it does happen rarely, but the problem is people don't want to make waves, right? Because, they don't want to shoot down somebody else's AVA. So a lot of things kind of sail through underneath the radar a little bit. But
yes, and big wineries can influence lines and places where they want to shoehorn their brands in so they can use prestigious AVAs and blah, blah, blah.
I've been contacted by people that say, hey, we want an AVA. We heard you write petitions. This is where we think it should go. I said, well, that makes no sense whatsoever. Well, we want it to incorporate, and what they're obviously trying to do.
Wherever their vineyard is.
Well, it's where their vineyard is, but they're also trying to make it do something illogical and loop out and grab a really famous vineyard so that they're in the same ballpark as this person. They want to be looped in with these other guys, right? And I'm like, well, you can't justify that in any. So I'm not going to do it. So I'm fortunate in that I kind of write AVA petitions because I enjoy it, and I have this full-time job as a college professor. So maybe if it was the only thing I did for a living, I would write BS petitions, but I'm not going to do that.
No, I don't think you would, because it's not the right thing to do. Ultimately, we're trying to make things make more sense. I do understand some of the people saying that they're meaningless if you take it versus Italy or Spain or France or Portugal. It really is kind of meaningless because we don't have that kind of level of specificity that would tell a consumer, an educated consumer, hey, if you get something from Walla Walla, I mean, what does that even mean? It's a big bowl in the middle of a desert,
we have
green bowl.
Our annual precipitation from one side of the AVA, on the west side of the AVA, it's 8 inches, and on the east side of the AVA, it's 26 inches. So it transitions from desert to a fair amount of precipitation. We can even dry farm grapes at the east side and it's a sagebrush desert on the other side of the AVA. So
oh my gosh,
huge variations.
But it's crazy.
I want to get back to something you said earlier, and you made a great point about manufactured wines versus wines of terroir, and beverages versus wines. And I couldn't agree more. That's not to say that there are some yummy beverages made, because there's some pretty yummy beverages made and they're delicious, but they just, of course, don't excite me as a terroir guy, and I think of the quickest way to sell a bottle of wine out of a tasting room is to put tons of new oak on it. And oak is the terroir destroyer, obliterator. And it drives me crazy because I go through and I taste so many wines and it's just more oak, more oak, more oak. You don't taste the place, you taste the oak. And there are other additives that you can use. And I find myself getting snobby about that. And I say, well, if that's what people want to drink, more power to them. Let them drink it. And if somebody has to make a living, and the best way they can make a living is to put oak on their wines, and then it flies out the door for $60 a bottle, then they're happy and the customer's happy. But I think it's just important to educate people and let them know there are other kinds of wines that open up whole new worlds to you, that aren't overdone and where the terroir is allowed to come to the front.
And where they won't be the same every year. Kevin, thank you so much for your time. This was such you can tell that I am obviously fascinated by this topic, and I wish I could come to Whitman and take your class, because these are the kinds of things. I love geology. I think it's super interesting. And you have so many answers that I think people really need to hear. So I'm so happy that we did this and recorded this, because I think that there's a lot of nonsense that goes on about terroir. And it can't be perpetuated. I don't want to perpetuate it, but I also want to make sure that people who are drinking the wine, when they hear these things, your radar has to go off. Now, hearing this, I think people will kind of call BS on things. And that is super important. It's a huge, huge service you've just done for our audience. So thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Love to talk with you more specifically about wine in the Pacific Northwest. One of these days.
100%. I will definitely, if you're willing, I am willing. So we will do another show. You'll be a regular, hopefully. You're just fantastic. Thank you so much.
Sure. My pleasure.
And with that, this has been another episode of Wine for Normal People. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.